In hindsight, it feels weird that I didn't think their behavior was odd, but I was so in love with David that I didn't even care how his parents were. Neither did I care about the fact that they demanded that I live with them once we got married. I just agreed to all their terms and conditions because I wanted to marry David, and I assumed that so did he. He was my first serious boyfriend, and before him, I'd only ever had short flings with either men who weren't serious about me or men whom I didn't care for much. David was sweet, charming, and seemed like the perfect guy while we were dating, so I didn't think there was anything wrong with moving in with my in-laws once we got married. To be fair, they lived in a literal mansion, and I believed that we'd have our personal space in spite of the living arrangement. His parents had also been quite civil to me before we got hitched, and that was yet another reason for me not to question things. After I said yes to his proposal and agreed to their arrangement, it was my in-laws who seemed thrilled and covered the cost of the entire wedding, even though my parents had said that they wouldn't mind splitting the cost. My family and I actually thought that they really liked me, and we even discussed at length how they were being so kind to me. We had no idea what was to come, especially with regards to David, who had never been anything but perfect in my head. David and I ended the lease on our rented apartment a week before our wedding and moved in with his parents soon after the wedding. The first few days were nice enough, but gradually things began to change for the worse, and it was so slow in the initial days that I barely even noticed it. Both Sean and Naomi had started becoming a lot colder towards me and weren't as civil in their way of speaking as they used to be earlier. They'd ignore my existence if it suited them, and then if they were feeling mean, they'd make snide comments about me and my family. David told me not to mind it initially and said that once we'd had a baby, it would cement my place in the family and my in-laws would turn over a new leaf, but I wasn't ready to have kids and wanted to wait it out. That led to a few arguments and fights between us, after which he started growing distant from me and wouldn't spend as much time with me as he would earlier. This was just the first 3 months of our marriage, and they'd already started showing their true colors, but I still stupidly kept hoping that things would get better eventually. After a couple of months passed, the pressure to have a baby began to build from all sides, and I began to seriously consider moving back home, but every time I'd say that to David, he'd tell me that he loved me and couldn't bear to live without me. It became a vicious cycle, and I was just so exhausted that I even fell behind at work. I'd already said no to taking the lead on a few big projects that had been offered to me and let others manage those because I wasn't sure if I'd be able to handle the pressure from my in-laws and at work altogether. I was in a very dark place at the time and didn't even have the energy to fight for myself when it came to David and his parents and their constant nagging and jibes. I kind of gave up and took it all without complaint because I didn't feel brave enough to say a word, and looking back, it sucks that I let things get so bad in the first place at all. I could have left him, but I loved him, and every time I'd want to leave, he'd play the "I love you and can't live without you" card, which just made it impossible for me to leave. I was already feeling weak, and that just made me feel worse about even thinking of leaving when my husband insisted that he loved me so much. I was trapped, so to speak. This went on for a while and would have probably gone on for longer had I not discovered David's affair. About 3 weeks ago, I was reading in bed and David had gone on a jog. He'd left his phone on the bed, but after a while, I heard buzzing from another source which seemed weird. I checked the phone that was on his bed and that wasn't buzzing, so I looked all over the room and located another phone in his laptop bag. I'd never seen that phone before, and neither did I know anyone by the name of Jessica, and it took me a few seconds to try and process what I was witnessing. I kept the phone with me and tried to unlock it with no luck, so I decided to wait for David to come back home. When he came back home, we talked for a while and then he went to sleep. After he fell asleep, I used his face to unlock the phone and went through the only messages he had on this phone, the ones with Jessica. Their texts were all pretty explicit, and it was obvious that he was having an affair with this lady. They'd made several plans to meet and had gone through with those plans as well, from the looks of it. The texts went back to almost 4 months, after we'd just been together a little over half a year. The recent texts weren't very flirty or cute though, and were mostly Jessica demanding an explanation for something that had happened and insisting that he either leave me or he get the job done that he'd promised. David had been ignoring her for the most part, and that's probably why she'd called that day. While reading the texts, I recorded it all with my phone and even took screenshots and sent them to my email address for good measure. Then I cried myself to sleep as silently as I could because the realization that David had been cheating on me for the past 4 months had finally hit me, and I couldn't hold it together anymore. I cried the entire night away, but by the next morning, I was ready to confront David about what I'd found. I expected him to deny it or try to get me to forgive him, but he did none of those things to my surprise. He owned it and told me very confidently that he had cheated on me with an employee, and everyone in the family knew about it as well. Apparently, he'd meant to tell me about it, but he thought that it would get in the way of having a child, and he didn't want that right now because his parents were hounding him to have a baby so they'd have an heir for the company at the earliest. That was pretty much my only purpose as a member of their family, to present them with a kid so they'd have someone to take over the business eventually, and that's why he'd married me so early. According to him and my in-laws, these were my prime years and I'd have to have a baby soon. It was already bad enough that I came from such a financially weak background. The least I could do for them was give them a healthy child at the right time. He even had the audacity to tell me that he was getting stressed out because of my refusal to have a baby and the pressure that his parents had put him under, which is why he'd had an affair, and he'd been honest with his family about it, so there was no need for me to get so mad since his parents didn't mind. Jessica was just his stress relief, but at the end of the day, I was the one he loved and I was his wife, so I didn't have to worry. After saying all that rubbish to me, he left for work that day without even waiting for a reply because he thought this was totally normal behavior. I packed my stuff up right after he left and snuck out of the house to go back to my parents' place, where I told them everything once I got there. They had no idea how my life was at my in-laws' place because I'd never told them out of fear that there'd be a ton of drama if I did tell them the truth about how I was being treated by my husband and in-laws. After I found out about the affair, I realized there was no point in holding back anymore and spilled everything. My parents were very supportive and instantly put me in touch with one of their friends who happened to have a son, a divorce attorney. I told David that I needed some time to think and that I'd be living with my parents for a while, and he bought it. In the meantime, I worked out the divorce papers with my lawyer, and within 3 days, he'd been served. He didn't see it coming because I hadn't mentioned anything about divorce even after I'd learned about the affair, so he was definitely taken aback the day he was served and came right over to my parents' house. He thought that he could argue his way back into my life, but in my head, our relationship was over and I'd accepted that, so his arguments were all pointless. He went back home disappointed that I wasn't staying with him despite his cheating, which just goes to show that he really did think of me as nothing but a huge pushover who could be bossed around all the time, and I'd stay nevertheless. The day after that, I received a call from my in-laws, and Naomi told me that I'd pay for what I'd done to her son because he'd apparently been miserable once he realized I wasn't coming back. She told me that I'd made her son cry and that's why they'd make sure that I was absolutely destroyed in court. I told them I could handle it and then blocked them, but that was just all talk. I knew they were rich and influential people, so picking a fight with them wasn't exactly in my best interests. After contemplating for a couple of days, I decided to take a leap of faith and get in touch with Jessica. I remembered that they hadn't been on good terms in the recent past, judging by their texts, and I hoped that she'd be willing to help me out. After a lot of stalking, I found out that Jessica was actually an employee where David